My father was smiling when he announced that our family business had been sold for $50 million. Everyone at the Thanksgiving table looked proud of him. My brother leaned back in his chair, accepting congratulations like he had been waiting years for that moment. My aunt smiled. My cousins whispered to each other. Even my father looked younger than he had in years. Then he looked directly at me. "You won't be receiving anything from this," he said. "You walked away. Your brother stayed and built this company." A few people laughed softly. I didn't. I simply folded my hands in my lap and looked at the table. What they didn't know was that I already knew exactly who had made the $50 million offer. And I knew something else. The company behind that offer belonged to me. But I hadn't planned to tell them that night. Not yet. For most of my life, my father had been very good at deciding who mattered in our family. My brother was the future of the business. I was the daughter who helped. That was the story he had told for years, and eventually everyone around him had learned to repeat it. So when he announced the sale, I wasn't surprised that he placed my brother at the center of the story. What surprised me was how confidently he said I had walked away. Because in his mind, that was exactly what I had done. I had left town. I had stopped working at the store. And I had built a life somewhere he never bothered to understand. But there was one detail he didn't know. The buyer he was celebrating that evening was not some distant investment group. It was my company. The same company that had grown from the business plan he once refused to read. I watched him lift his glass. "To the future," he said. The room answered with applause. I kept my eyes on him. There was something almost peaceful about watching a person celebrate a truth they didn't understand. 9 years earlier, I had stood in his office with a carefully prepared plan for saving the family business. He had barely looked at it. That memory had stayed with me because of how ordinary the rejection had felt. There was no dramatic argument. No slammed door. No screaming match. Just my father leaning back in his chair and telling me, in a calm voice, that hardware was a man's business. He said my brother understood the industry better. He said customers wanted to deal with someone who belonged in that world. He said I should find something more suitable. I had nodded. Then I left. I never forgot those words. But I also never let them decide what happened next. I built a company. At first, it was small enough that I knew every customer by name. Then it grew. One contractor became 10. 10 became hundreds. Eventually, businesses across multiple states were using software built from the very ideas my father had dismissed. I became successful. Very successful. But I never told my family how successful. I still came home for Thanksgiving. I still sat at the same table. I still listened to my father talk about the business, as though I had never understood it. And now, years later, he was proudly announcing a $50 million sale. Then he revealed the buyer's name. The room grew excited again. My father smiled. My brother raised his glass. And someone across the table said, "What a perfect ending." That was when I finally spoke. "That company is mine." The words were quiet. Almost too quiet. For a second, nobody reacted. My father stared at me. My brother stopped moving. Then my aunt slowly lowered her glass. "What did you say?" my father asked. I looked at him. I own the company making the offer. The applause disappeared. The room became completely silent. My father looked around the table as if someone might explain what I had just said. Nobody could. He looked at me differently then, not with pride, but with confusion. That almost made sense. Pride would have required him to admit that he had been wrong, and confusion was safer. I could see questions forming behind his eyes. Where had the money come from? Who had helped me? How had I managed to build something that large without him hearing about it? I had answers to every question. But I had learned something important over the years. Silence was sometimes more powerful than an explanation. Because the woman he believed had walked away from his business had apparently spent 9 years building the company that was now worth enough to buy it. And that was only the first thing he was about to learn. Then, the first thing my grandfather taught me was not how to sell anything. He taught me how to notice what was missing. I was still a child when I began spending most of my afternoons inside our family's building supply store. It was a large, old-fashioned place filled with shelves of tools, boxes of screws, rolls of wire, paint, plumbing parts, and everything else a contractor might need. To me, it felt less like a business and more like a second home. My grandfather had built the company with his father, and by the time I was old enough to understand what work meant, he had already spent decades learning every corner of the industry. He never treated me like I was too young to listen. Instead, he showed me. He taught me how to recognize the difference between a customer who wanted the cheapest product and one who needed something that would last. He taught me why certain contractors always ordered the same materials and why others changed suppliers without warning. Most importantly, he taught me to watch. If you understand what people need before they ask, he once told me, running his fingers across a row of labeled boxes, you understand business. I remembered those words for the rest of my life. While my grandfather taught me, my father watched from a distance. He was proud of the family business, but his pride had a direction. It pointed toward my brother. My brother was the son. That seemed to be enough. When he helped around the store, my father called it experience. When I did the same work, it was simply helping the family. When my brother suggested an idea, my father listened. When I suggested one, he usually smiled, nodded, and moved on. I learned early not to expect the same reaction. Still, I worked. I counted inventory. I helped prepare orders. I answered phones. I watched delivery schedules. I learned which suppliers were reliable and which ones caused problems. I even began noticing small patterns in our sales that many adults seemed to overlook. The business had been built on relationships, and those relationships were strong. But the way we operated was changing. Customers wanted faster service. Contractors wanted accurate deliveries. Inventory had to be tracked more carefully. The world outside our store was becoming more modern while we were still relying on systems my grandfather had used decades earlier. I could see it. My grandfather could see it too. My father saw the problems, but he did not see me as the person who could solve them. That difference became more obvious as I grew older. There was never one moment when my father officially told me I had no future in the business. He didn't need to. His actions said it for him. My brother was gradually given more responsibility. He attended meetings. He spoke with suppliers. He sat beside our father during important decisions. People began assuming he would eventually inherit the company. I was never officially recognized as an employee. There was no title waiting for me. No formal position. No clear path into management. I could spend 10 hours fixing a problem and still be introduced as my father's daughter who helped at the store. For a while, I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that good work should speak for itself. But eventually, I understood something painful. Good work only speaks when the people in power are willing to listen. My grandfather was different. He never cared whether I was a boy or a girl. He cared whether I paid attention, whether I learned, whether I kept my word. Whenever I doubted myself, I remembered the old spirit level he kept in his office. It was scratched and worn, but he treated it carefully. Everything has to be balanced, he once said. I didn't understand then how much that simple lesson would matter later. After college, I decided to take my education further. I earned my MBA. For the first time, I believed I had something that could not simply be dismissed as childhood experience. I had studied finance, operations, management, growth strategy. I understood the language my father respected. And when I returned home, I didn't come back asking for a favor. I came back with a plan. I had spent months studying the company. I knew where money was being lost. I knew which parts of the inventory system were outdated. I knew how much business we were losing because contractors could not get deliveries when they needed them. I knew there were customers outside our usual market who could have become long-term accounts. I put everything into a detailed proposal. For the first time, I thought maybe my father would finally look at me and see what my grandfather had seen years earlier. Someone who noticed what was missing. I carried that hope into his office. I had no idea that in a few minutes, he would give me the reason I would eventually leave the town for good. And the plan he refused to read would become the foundation of everything I built afterward. My father rejected my business plan before he reached the second page. I still remembered the way he held the folder that morning. He didn't throw it away. He didn't tear it apart. He simply placed it on his desk, opened it, glanced at the first page, and then looked back at me. For a few seconds, I thought he was actually considering it. I had spent months preparing that plan. I had studied our inventory. I had reviewed supplier costs. I had looked at customer patterns and delivery schedules. I knew where we were losing money, and more importantly, I knew where we were losing opportunities. Our contractors were waiting too long for deliveries. Some customers were going elsewhere because we couldn't tell them exactly when their orders would arrive. Our inventory system was outdated, which meant we sometimes had too much of something nobody needed and not enough of something customers urgently wanted. The answer wasn't complicated. We needed a modern inventory system. We needed better tracking. We needed contractor-focused delivery routes. And we needed to stop depending on the same small group of customers we had served for decades. I believed we could expand. Not recklessly. Carefully. I had numbers to support it. I had projections. I had a timeline. I had even mapped out the first year so the changes wouldn't overwhelm the employees. I thought my father would at least read it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair. "You've been away at school too long," he said. I stayed quiet. He tapped the folder with 2 fingers. "This isn't how this business works." I reminded him that the business was struggling, that our competitors were already using technology to manage inventory and deliveries, that customers expected faster service. He listened, but not in the way I hoped. He wasn't listening to the plan. He was waiting for his turn to dismiss it. Then he said something I never forgot. "Hardware isn't really a woman's business." The words were simple, almost casual. That was what made them hurt. I looked at him for a moment. I had spent my childhood in those aisles. I had learned the business from my grandfather. I had studied for an MBA because I wanted to make the company stronger. And somehow, none of that mattered because my father had already decided what kind of person belonged in the business. My brother walked into the office a few minutes later. My father immediately changed. His voice became warmer. He asked my brother about a supplier meeting. He asked what he thought about the company's future. Then he mentioned that someday, the business would probably be his. I remember sitting there and realizing that the decision had already been made. Not because my brother had earned it. Not because my plan had failed. But because my father had never imagined me as his successor. I could have argued. I could have demanded that he take my work seriously. I could have reminded him how many years I had spent helping that company. But something inside me had become very still. My grandfather had once taught me that a level only mattered if it showed the truth. That morning, I realized my father's opinion was not the truth about me. It was only his opinion. So I gathered my papers. My father barely looked up. "You're taking this personally," he said. I stopped at the door. "No," I said quietly. "I'm taking it seriously." Then I left. I didn't make a scene. I didn't tell my family I was done forever. I didn't even know exactly what I was going to do next. I only knew I couldn't keep standing in a room where my future had already been decided for me. A few weeks later, I left town. I carried very little with me. Some clothes, my laptop, my savings, and the business plan my father had refused to read. I kept that plan because I couldn't let his rejection become the final judgment on the idea. If he believed the building supply industry didn't need what I had designed, I would find out for myself. At first, I didn't think about becoming wealthy. I didn't think about buying anything. I didn't think about proving my father wrong. I simply wanted to build something useful. I started by talking to contractors, then suppliers, then small building companies that were tired of losing time because they couldn't track inventory properly. I listened. I took notes. I changed the software. I made mistakes. Some early customers left. Others stayed. Every problem taught me something. Every small success gave me another reason to keep going. And slowly, the idea my father had rejected began to take shape. My company wasn't born from a perfect business plan. It was built from the same thing my grandfather had taught me as a child. Pay attention. Notice what is missing. Fix it. For the first time in my life, nobody was telling me where I belonged. I had to decide that for myself. And I did. Years later, my father would learn what that decision had created. But he would not hear it from me. He would see it in numbers, in contracts, in thousands of businesses using my company's software, and eventually in a $50 million offer. At the time, though, I knew none of that. I was simply a woman in a new city, sitting alone at a small desk, opening the same business plan my father had dismissed. I looked at the first page. Then I smiled. Because this time, nobody was going to tell me to close the folder. And that was the beginning point. 9 years passed before my father realized that the business he had rejected was already everywhere. At first, my company was nothing impressive. It was a small office, a few computers, and a handful of people who believed the idea could work. I was not sitting in some beautiful corner office. I was answering customer calls, fixing software problems, reviewing contracts, and sometimes staying awake until 2 in the morning because something had broken that I did not know how to fix. But I kept going. The first customers were small contractors. They didn't care about my family name. They didn't know my father. They didn't know that the system they were using had started with a business plan that had once been dismissed in a quiet office back home. They only cared that it worked. That was enough for me. Our software helped businesses track inventory more accurately. It made ordering easier. It helped contractors see what was available and where their deliveries were. The more people used it, the more problems they found, and every problem gave us another chance to improve. I learned something during those early years. Building a company was very different from building an argument. An argument ended when someone admitted you were right. A company had to keep proving itself every morning. So I stopped thinking about my father. At least I tried to. I focused on customers. I focused on employees. I focused on making the product better. Then something strange happened. The company started growing faster than I expected. One state became several. A few dozen customers became hundreds. Then thousands. Building supply companies, contractors, warehouses, and distributors began using our system across multiple states. Investors became interested. Larger businesses called. People who had never heard my name suddenly wanted meetings with me. Eventually, I became wealthy. Not overnight. Not because of one lucky deal. It happened slowly, through years of work that most people never saw. I could have gone back home and announced everything. I could have walked into my father's store and told him exactly what I had built. I never did. Part of me wanted to. Another part of me was tired of wanting his approval. So I kept my life separate. When holidays came, I still went home. I sat at the same table. I listened to the same stories. My father talked about the store. My brother talked about suppliers. Everyone discussed the family business as if the future had already been decided. My future, in their minds, had nothing to do with it. Sometimes my father would mention competitors in our industry. He would complain about software companies charging too much. He would say the old way of doing things was still better. I never corrected him. I simply listened. My brother became more involved in the business. My father trusted him with more decisions. The store continued operating, but it was no longer the strong company my grandfather had built. I could see that every time I visited. The inventory problems were still there. The delivery system was still behind. The customer base was getting older. The same warning signs I had written about years earlier were becoming harder to ignore. But I said nothing. I had learned that people rarely listen when they believe they already know the answer. One evening, after another family visit, my advisor asked me a question. "You still want your father's approval, don't you?" I didn't answer immediately. I looked down at my coffee. "I don't need it," I finally said. That wasn't my question. I smiled because he was right. There was still a small part of me that wanted my father to look at what I had built and understand. Not because I needed the money. Not because I needed a title. I wanted him to know that the daughter he had dismissed had understood something he had missed. But I never told him. Maybe I was protecting myself. Maybe I was protecting the fragile peace between us. Or maybe I was still waiting for a moment when the truth would matter. That moment came sooner than I expected. I received a call about the family business. The person on the other end didn't give me much information at first. The company was struggling. There were serious financial problems. The family was quietly considering a sale. I asked for the documents. When they arrived, I read everything carefully. The numbers were worse than I had imagined. The company needed help. Real help. Not another temporary loan. Not another year of cutting expenses. It needed someone willing to rebuild it. I sat at my desk for a long time after reading the final report. I thought about the store where I had spent my childhood. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about the old spirit level sitting in his office years ago. And then I looked at the company I had built. My company had the technology. It had the money. It had the experience. And it could give the family business something it desperately needed. A future. There was only one problem. If my father knew I was the buyer, he might reject the offer simply because it came from me. I knew him well enough to understand that. So I made a decision. I would make the offer anonymously. My company would approach the acquisition through a separate structure. No family name. No connection to me. Nothing that would allow my father to reject the deal because of who was behind it. The offer would be $50 million. It was more than the business was worth on paper. But I wasn't buying numbers. I was buying time. I was protecting employees. I was protecting my grandfather's legacy. And perhaps, without admitting it to myself, I was protecting the little girl who had once believed that one day her father would finally see her. The documents were prepared. The offer was submitted. Then I waited. And for the first time in 9 years, I was about to step back into my family's business without them knowing I had entered the room. I did not submit the $50 million offer under my own name. That decision took me longer to make than I wanted to admit. The family business was failing. I knew it. The financial reports made that clear. Years of outdated systems, weak customer growth, and poor management had slowly pushed the company toward a point where selling was becoming unavoidable. But the business was more than numbers to me. It was the place where my grandfather had taught me everything he knew. It was where I had spent my childhood. It was where I had first learned to understand customers, inventory, deliveries, and the simple discipline of keeping your word. And it was still home to 240 people who depended on those jobs. I couldn't watch all of that disappear. My company had the resources to buy the business. We had the technology to modernize it. And we had enough experience to know exactly where the old operation had gone wrong. But there was one problem. My father. If he knew I was the buyer, there was a real chance he would reject the offer before even looking at the numbers. I knew how he thought. He had rejected my business plan because it came from me. He had spent years assuming my brother would be the one to carry the family business forward. Even after my own company became successful, he still didn't know what I actually did. So I decided to remove myself from the equation. My company created an acquisition structure that would allow the offer to be submitted without revealing my identity. My name would not appear in the initial negotiations. The buyer would be a company that nobody in my family recognized. The offer would be $50 million. When my legal advisor placed the final documents in front of me, I read every page carefully. Then I signed. For a few seconds, I simply sat there. I had imagined this moment in different ways over the years. Sometimes I imagined walking into my father's office and telling him what I had built. Sometimes I imagined showing him the numbers. Sometimes I imagined him finally saying that he had been wrong. But now that the opportunity was actually in front of me, I didn't want any of those things. I wanted the business to survive. That was what I kept telling myself. My advisor looked at me. You understand that if this goes through, your father may never know you saved the company. I understand. And if he does find out? I looked back at the documents. Then he'll have to decide what matters more. What do you mean? The business, I said, or being right about me? He didn't answer. Neither did I. The offer was submitted. Then came the waiting. Days passed. Then weeks. During that time, I continued living my normal life. I went to work. I attended meetings. I reviewed company reports. And when Thanksgiving approached, I made plans to go home. That was the strange part. I knew something enormous was happening behind the scenes, yet I still packed the same simple suitcase I had used for years. I still drove to my family's house. I still walked through the same front door. My father greeted me like nothing had changed. He didn't know that the company offering $50 million for his business was mine. He didn't know that the people reviewing his records worked for me. He didn't know that the technology he had once called unnecessary was now the foundation of a company large enough to buy his entire operation. And I didn't tell him. Not because I wanted to embarrass him. Not because I wanted revenge. I simply wasn't ready to turn the acquisition into another argument about who had been right. I wanted the numbers to speak first. At dinner, my father talked about the future of the store. My brother sat beside him. They discussed the sale as though it were already a victory. I listened quietly. My brother looked confident. My father looked proud. I wondered if either of them understood how close the business was to disappearing. Probably not. Then my father raised his glass. "We finally found a serious buyer," he said. Everyone smiled. I lowered my eyes. The buyer was me. But nobody at that table knew. Later that evening, my advisor called me. The offer had moved forward. There was going to be a formal announcement. My father planned to tell the entire family about the sale at Thanksgiving. I listened in silence. Then he said something that made me pause. "There is one more thing." "What?" "The buyer has been approved." I waited. "And your father doesn't know who is behind it." I looked across the room at the old photographs hanging on the wall. One showed my grandfather standing outside the store when the business was still small. I remembered his hands, his patience, his old spirit level. Then I heard my advisor say, "Are you sure you want to keep your identity hidden?" I thought about the girl I had been. The girl who had worked beside her grandfather. The daughter who had brought her father a plan and watched him dismiss it. The woman who had spent 9 years building something of her own. "Yes," I said. My voice was calm. "Let him make his decision without knowing it's me." I hung up. The next morning, I went back to the store with my family. Nobody treated me differently. Nobody suspected anything. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Because the largest reveal of my life was no longer months away. It was sitting at the same Thanksgiving table. And my father was preparing to announce it himself. My father smiled when he told everyone I would get nothing. He said it so casually that, for a moment, I almost wondered if I had heard him correctly. Thanksgiving dinner had barely begun when he stood at the end of the table and announced that the family business had been sold for $50 million. Everyone reacted exactly the way he expected. My aunt clapped. My cousin smiled. My brother leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed the evening belonged to him. My father looked around the room and enjoyed every second of it. Then his eyes settled on me. "I want everyone to understand something," he said. "She won't be receiving anything from this sale." The room became slightly quieter. He continued before I could say a word. "She chose to leave. Her brother stayed. He worked for this company. He helped keep it alive." My brother nodded. I kept my hands folded beneath the table. There was no point correcting him. Not yet. For years, my father had told the same story. My brother stayed. I left. Therefore, my brother deserved the future. It was simple. It was also completely wrong. But that night, I wasn't there to argue about the past. I was waiting for the future to speak for itself. My father raised his glass. "To the next generation," he said. Everyone lifted their glasses. I didn't. I watched him carefully. He looked proud, almost relieved. He had spent years worrying about the family business, and now he believed he had finally secured its future. He began explaining the sale. The buyer was a serious company. The offer was strong. The deal would protect the business. The employees would have stability. My father spoke with the confidence of a man who believed he had won. My brother occasionally added details, making it clear that he considered himself part of the success. I listened. The strange thing was that I already knew more about the buyer than anyone at that table. I knew the company's leadership. I knew its financial position. I knew its strategy. I knew exactly why it wanted the family business. Because I was the one who had approved the offer. But my father didn't know that. Nobody did. Then he reached for a folder sitting beside his plate. "This is the buyer," he announced. People leaned forward. My heart didn't race. I had imagined this moment for years, but now that it was here, I felt surprisingly calm. My father opened the folder and read the name aloud. The company name filled the room. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then my aunt smiled. "That sounds impressive." My father nodded proudly. "It is." My brother looked pleased. I looked at my father. He still had no idea. Then I heard myself speak. "That company is mine." My voice was quiet. No anger. No smile. Just 4 words. Nobody moved. My cousin looked at me. My aunt stopped halfway through lifting her glass. My brother's expression changed completely. My father stared at me. "What did you say?" I looked at him. "I own that company." Silence. It was the kind of silence that made every small sound suddenly noticeable. The clock on the wall. A fork touching a plate. Someone shifting in their chair. My father slowly lowered the folder. "How?" I didn't answer. He looked at my brother. Then back at me. "You expect me to believe you built a company like that?" I stayed quiet. He started asking questions faster. Where had I gotten the money? Who had invested? How long had I been doing this? Why had nobody told him? The more questions he asked, the more his confidence disappeared. My brother finally spoke. "You never said any of this." I looked at him. "You never asked." That was all I gave them. My father stood up. He looked angry now. Not because the business was in danger. Because the person making the strongest offer was the daughter he had spent years believing was incapable of leading it. "You hid this from us," he said. I kept my work private. "That isn't the same thing." "No," I said. "It isn't." The room remained frozen. The family members who had laughed earlier were now watching me differently. There was no applause. No celebration. No one knew what to say. And I didn't need them to say anything. For years, I had imagined vindication as something loud. A speech. A confrontation. A moment where I could list every time my father had underestimated me. But standing there, I realized I didn't want any of that. The truth was already sitting on the table. The buyer was my company. The offer was $50 million. And the business my father had refused to let me help lead was now valuable enough for me to purchase. My father finally sat down. His face had changed. He looked at me as if he were seeing a person he had never met. Then he said something I had not expected. "I don't understand how you did this." I looked at him for a moment. There was pain behind the question. But there was pride too. And perhaps that was why I didn't answer. He had spent 9 years refusing to see me. I wasn't going to spend one evening forcing him to. He picked up the folder again. Then his expression hardened. "If you're the buyer," he said, "then the deal is off." The room went silent again. My father closed the folder. He had just learned who was offering $50 million. And instead of accepting it, he was about to reject the deal for one reason. The buyer was his daughter. The competing buyer offered less money, but my father preferred losing $4 million to selling the business to me. I learned about his decision the next morning. He had rejected my $50 million offer. Not because the price was too low. Not because the terms were unreasonable. Not because another buyer had offered more. He simply could not accept that his daughter was the person standing on the other side of the deal. Instead, he chose another company. Their offer was $46 million. $4 million less. When my advisor told me, I was sitting at my desk reviewing the acquisition documents. I didn't argue. I didn't call my father. I didn't send him another message. I simply said, "Then let them do their review." My advisor looked at me carefully. "You're not going to fight this?" "No, why?" "Because if they believe the business is worth $46 million, they should be allowed to discover what they're actually buying." He understood what I meant. A company could look healthy from the outside and still be full of problems. That was exactly what we needed to determine. So my team began a deeper review of the family business. We examined supplier contracts, outstanding invoices, bank records, inventory reports, payroll, customer accounts. Every document that could tell us what was really happening inside the company. At first, the problems looked familiar. Inventory was still poorly managed. Some accounts were overdue. Several suppliers had been waiting too long for payment. But then we noticed something that didn't fit. The numbers were inconsistent. Some supplier balances didn't match the payment records. Certain liabilities appeared to have been moved or delayed. A few reports showed the company in better financial shape than the supporting documents suggested. My team kept digging. Then one of our analysts called me. "There is something here." I asked what he meant. He sent me a file. I opened it. The amount at the bottom made me stop. More than $4 million. Unpaid supplier debt. I read the report twice. Then a third time. The debt had not been properly reflected in the financial picture presented to potential buyers. Someone had made the business look healthier than it really was. I didn't immediately know who had done it, but I had a strong suspicion. My brother. He had been managing parts of the business for years. He had been the person my father trusted. The person everyone believed had stayed behind to save the company. Now there was evidence that someone had been hiding the fact that the company was already drowning. I told my advisor not to contact my father yet. "Why not?" he asked. "Because I want the full picture first." That was important. I had no interest in making an accusation based on one document. So we continued. The more we investigated, the worse it became. Supplier accounts had been delayed. Financial records had been adjusted. Certain debts had been pushed into later periods. The company wasn't simply struggling. It had been struggling much longer than my family knew. And someone had worked very hard to keep that truth hidden. Then my brother contacted me. He asked to meet privately. We chose a quiet place away from the family home. When he arrived, he looked different from the confident man I had seen at Thanksgiving. He looked tired. He sat across from me and didn't speak for several seconds. Then he said, "You found it." I didn't answer. He looked down at the table. I didn't have a choice. I kept listening. He explained that the business had been losing money for years. Suppliers were demanding payment. Customers were leaving. Expenses kept rising. He had been trying to keep everything running because he believed that if the truth came out, our father would lose everything. "So you changed the records," I said. He didn't deny it. "I delayed things." "That isn't what the documents say." He looked away. For the first time, I saw fear in him. Not the fear of being embarrassed. The fear of losing everything. Then he made his offer. "If you help me," he said, "I can convince Dad to accept your deal." I waited. "You keep the debt private. I tell him the sale to you is the best option. Everyone gets what they want." I understood exactly what he was asking. He wanted me to use my power to protect him. And he wanted me to become part of the same system of secrets that had damaged our family for years. I could have agreed. If I kept quiet, I could secure the business. My father might never know how close the company had come to collapse. My brother could keep his reputation. The employees could keep their jobs. And I could finally own the place where I had grown up. It would have been easy. Too easy. I looked at my brother. "You know what the problem is?" I asked. He waited. "We keep calling secrets solutions." He said nothing. I continued. "That is how we got here." He lowered his head. I didn't insult him. I didn't threaten him. I didn't tell him I would destroy him. I simply refused. The debt would not remain hidden. But I also wasn't going to use it to publicly humiliate him. There was a difference between exposing the truth and enjoying someone's collapse. My brother left without another word. I stayed there for several minutes after he was gone. I thought about my grandfather. He had taught me that a business was built on trust. Without trust, numbers were only numbers. That night, I made my decision. I would tell my father the truth. But I wouldn't do it with a speech. I wouldn't stand in front of the family and expose my brother. I would give my father the evidence and let him decide what to do with it. So I asked my team to reduce everything we had discovered to one clear page. One page. No insults. No accusations. No dramatic language. Just the debt. The missing information. And the facts. Because the next time my family gathered around a table, I wasn't going to fight for control. I was going to put the truth in front of the person who had spent years refusing to see it. And once he read that page, none of us would be able to pretend anymore. I brought only one sheet of paper to the final negotiation. That was all. No stack of reports. No angry speech. No lawyers standing behind me waiting to attack. Just one page. At the top was the number that had been hidden for years. More than $4 million in unpaid supplier debt. Below it were the records that showed how the debt had been kept out of the financial picture. I had enough information to destroy my brother's reputation. I could have walked into that room and told everyone exactly what he had done. Instead, I folded the page once and placed it inside my folder. The final meeting was held in a conference room at the family business. My father sat at one end of the table. My brother sat beside him. Across from them were the people involved in the proposed sale. The competing buyer had already begun questioning the company's financial records. Their confidence was gone. The $46 million deal was no longer looking as safe as it had a few days earlier. My father knew something was wrong. He just didn't know how wrong it was. He kept asking questions. Why had certain supplier balances changed? Why were some payments missing? Why didn't the financial reports match the supporting documents? Nobody answered immediately. My brother stared at the table. I watched him quietly. He looked exhausted. For years, he had been trying to keep the family business alive while hiding how badly it was failing. That didn't excuse what he had done, but it helped me understand it. When the room finally became quiet, I reached into my folder. I took out the single page. Then I placed it in front of my father. He looked at it. "What is this?" "The debt," I said. He frowned. "What debt?" I didn't explain. I didn't need to. He started reading. His eyes moved slowly across the page. Then they stopped. He read the number again. More than $4 million. His face changed. He looked at my brother. "What is this?" My brother didn't answer. My father looked back at the page. "Is this real?" My brother finally whispered, "Yes." The room became completely still. I watched my father put one hand against the table. For the first time since I had known him, he looked like a man who had run out of answers. "You knew about this?" he asked his son. My brother nodded. "How long?" Silence. My father asked again. "How long?" My brother finally told him. Months. Then years. He explained that the company had been losing money faster than anyone realized. Suppliers had started demanding payment. Customers were leaving. Bills kept arriving. He had tried to cover one problem with another until the numbers became impossible to control. He said he had hidden the debt because he was afraid. Afraid of losing the business. Afraid of disappointing our father. Afraid of becoming the son who failed the family. My father listened without interrupting. Then my brother broke down. Not dramatically. There was no performance left in him. He simply lowered his head and admitted that he had been trying to keep the company alive long after he should have asked for help. I felt something inside me soften. Not because what he had done was right. It wasn't. But because I finally understood that we had all been trapped in the same family pattern. My father had spent years refusing to admit the business was changing. My brother had spent years hiding the damage. And I had spent years hiding my success. Everyone had been protecting something. Everyone had been afraid of the truth. I looked at my father. He was still holding the page. I could have reminded him of my old business plan. I could have told him that I had warned him about many of these problems years ago. I could have said, "I told you so." But I didn't. There was nothing useful left in those words. My father finally looked at me. "Why didn't you use this against him?" I paused. "Because that's not why I brought it." He looked confused. "I needed you to know the truth before you made another decision." My voice stayed calm. No anger. No satisfaction. Just the truth. The competing buyer's offer was now in serious trouble. The hidden debt changed the value of the company. It changed the risks. It changed everything. But I still hadn't decided what I would do next. My father had rejected my $50 million offer. He had chosen a company willing to pay less. And now that company was discovering that the business they wanted was in much worse shape than they had been told. I could have walked away. I had already built my own company. I didn't need the family business. I didn't need my father's approval. And after everything that had happened, I had every reason to let the deal collapse. Instead, I opened my folder again. My father watched me. "What are you doing?" I took out another document. He stared at it. I placed it in front of him. It was a new offer. The number at the top was exactly the same as before. $50 million. My father looked at the page. Then he looked at me. "You're still offering this?" "Yes." His expression changed. "After knowing about the debt?" "Yes." He didn't understand. Maybe I didn't completely understand it myself. But I knew one thing. I wasn't buying the business to win against my father. I was buying it because I had finally learned what it meant to choose what kind of person I wanted to be. The room stayed silent. My father slowly reached for the agreement. And this time, he didn't know whether he was signing away his business or finally giving his daughter the place in the family he had denied her for most of her life. I could have bought the company for much less. After the hidden debt was discovered, the value of the business had changed. The competing buyer was already questioning the deal. My father had fewer choices than he had ever had before. And yet, I offered the full $50 million. My advisor asked me if I was sure. I was. The new agreement came with conditions. Every one of the 240 employees would keep their job for at least 3 years. The family name would remain on the store. And the business would finally be modernized. Not destroyed. Not replaced. Modernized. The inventory system would be rebuilt. Contractor deliveries would be reorganized. Customer records would be improved. The company would finally use the technology and systems I had proposed years earlier. The same ideas my father had once rejected. When I placed the agreement in front of him, he read the conditions slowly. Then he looked at me. "You're willing to pay $50 million for this?" "Yes." "Even now?" "Yes." He shook his head. "I don't understand." I knew he didn't. For most of his life, my father had measured success in simple terms. Who controlled the business? Who made the decisions? Who earned the money? Who carried the family name forward? He couldn't understand why I would risk so much for a company that had rejected me. So I told him the truth. "I'm not just buying a business." He waited. "I'm risking my own company, my home, and my future to save the place where I grew up." Nobody spoke. I looked around the room. There were people sitting there whose lives depended on what happened next. Employees who had spent decades working for the company. People who had families. Mortgages. Children. Plans. They weren't numbers on a spreadsheet. They were people. And I didn't want their lives destroyed because our family couldn't admit that the old way of doing things was no longer working. My father looked down at the agreement again. "You could have walked away," he said. "I could have. Why didn't you?" I thought about my grandfather. About the store when it had been smaller. About the old shelves. The delivery trucks. The afternoons I had spent following him through the aisles. I remembered the spirit level in his office. I remembered his voice telling me that everything had to be balanced. "I didn't want the business to disappear," I said. That was the simplest answer. It was also the most honest. My father stayed quiet for a long time. Then he asked about my company. How had I built it? How had I managed to grow it so much? Why hadn't I told the family? I didn't give him a long explanation. "You never asked." He looked away. That answer seemed to hurt him more than anything else I could have said. Because it was true. For 9 years, I had visited home. I had sat at his table. I had listened to him talk about the industry. And not once had he asked me what I had built. He had already decided the answer. He believed I had left because I couldn't handle the business. The truth was that I had left because he wouldn't let me become part of it. But I didn't need to remind him anymore. He knew. The room became quiet again. Then my father reached for the pen. His hand paused above the signature line. I watched him. For years, I had imagined seeing my father finally accept me. I thought it would feel like victory. It didn't. It felt heavier than that. Because by then, I no longer needed his approval. I wanted the business saved. I wanted the employees protected. I wanted my grandfather's legacy to have another chance. My father signed. The pen made a small sound against the paper. That was it. No dramatic celebration. No applause. Just one signature. Then he opened a drawer beside him. For a moment, I didn't understand what he was looking for. He reached inside and pulled out a small, worn object. My grandfather's old spirit level. I recognized it immediately. The edges were scratched. The surface was faded. But I remembered it. My grandfather had carried it around the store for years. My father held it in both hands. Then he extended it toward me. "This belonged to him," he said. I took it carefully. He looked at me. "I should have given this to you a long time ago." I didn't know what to say. So I simply held it. The object weighed almost nothing. But it carried years inside it. My grandfather's lessons. My childhood. My father's rejection. My leaving. My company. The $50 million offer. Everything seemed connected to that small piece of metal and glass. My father sat back. For the first time, I didn't see him as the man who had rejected my plan. I saw him as an older man who had spent years making decisions out of pride and fear. That didn't erase what he had done. But I didn't need it erased. I needed it understood. The deal was signed. The employees would stay. The family name would remain above the door. And the company would finally receive the changes it had needed for years. As I walked out of the room with my grandfather's spirit level in my hand, I realized something I had spent almost a decade avoiding. I had not built my company only because I believed in the idea. A small part of me had built it because I wanted my father to see me, to finally look at me and understand that I had been capable all along. But I no longer needed that. The business was saved. My father had signed. And somehow, that wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing was what happened next. Because saving the company was only the beginning. Now I had to prove that the ideas my father had rejected years ago could actually bring the old business back to life. And this time, I wasn't trying to prove anything to him. I was doing it for the people who had stayed. The old spirit level stayed on my desk long after the business began recovering. I kept it beside my computer, where I could see it every morning. It was scratched. The metal was worn. The glass had a tiny mark near one edge. To anyone else, it looked like an old tool that had outlived its purpose. To me, it was something else. It was a reminder of where I had started, and of how long it had taken me to understand what I was really trying to prove. The first few months after the acquisition were difficult. Buying the company had been one thing. Saving it was another. We had to rebuild the inventory system from the ground up. We had to organize thousands of products that had been tracked poorly for years. We changed how contractor deliveries were scheduled. We improved customer records. We reached out to businesses that had stopped ordering from us. Some employees were nervous. They had heard promises before. They had watched management change. They had seen numbers decline. So I didn't expect them to trust me immediately. I didn't ask them to. I told them we would earn their trust through results. Slowly, the numbers began moving in the right direction. Orders became more accurate. Deliveries became faster. Customers started returning. New accounts came in. The store became busy again. One afternoon, I walked through the warehouse and saw something that made me stop. A contractor was standing near the loading area, talking with one of our employees. He was smiling. That simple moment meant more to me than any financial report. The business was alive again. Not because I had bought it for $50 million. Because people were beginning to believe it had a future. My brother stayed with the company. At first, I wasn't sure if that would work. There was too much history between us. Too many secrets. Too much resentment. But he began changing. He stopped hiding mistakes. When something went wrong, he reported it. When a supplier problem appeared, he addressed it. He started asking for help instead of pretending he had every answer. It wasn't a perfect transformation. People don't change that quickly. But he was trying. That mattered. My father changed more slowly. For a long time, he still struggled to understand that I was now the person making the major decisions. Sometimes I would catch him watching me during meetings. Not angrily. Not proudly. Just carefully. As though he were still trying to understand the daughter he had spent so many years misunderstanding. One afternoon, he walked into my office. His eyes went directly to the spirit level on my desk. "You still have that," he said. "Yes." He picked it up. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "Your grandfather would have liked what you've done." I looked at him. That sentence could have meant so much to me years earlier. Once, I would have waited my entire life to hear it. But when I finally did, I realized I didn't need it anymore. I smiled. "I think he would have liked what we did." My father looked at me. "We." I nodded. The business was never just mine. He placed the spirit level back on my desk. Then he left. That was probably the closest thing we ever had to an apology. It wasn't perfect. There were no long speeches, no dramatic tears, no way to erase years of favoritism with one conversation. But there was honesty. And for our family, honesty was a beginning. Sometimes I still thought about that Thanksgiving dinner. The way my father had told everyone I would receive nothing. The way my brother had accepted the praise. The way the room had gone silent when I revealed who the buyer was. For years, I had imagined that moment as the final victory. It wasn't. The real victory came later. It came when the employees kept their jobs. When the business started growing again. When my brother stopped hiding his mistakes. When my father finally understood that I had never needed to become his son to deserve his respect. And most importantly, it came when I stopped measuring my worth by whether he approved of me. That was the hardest lesson. I had spent 9 years building a successful company. But if I was honest with myself, part of that success had been driven by an old wound. I wanted to prove him wrong. I wanted him to look at my company and realize what he had lost. I wanted him to regret the day he pushed me away. But eventually, I understood something. Winning against my father would never heal me. I had to stop fighting a battle he didn't even realize he was still part of. So when I bought the business, I didn't do it to punish him. I did it because I finally had the power to choose what happened next. I could have let the company fail. I could have bought it cheaply and removed the family name. I could have fired everyone and rebuilt the operation from nothing. Instead, I chose to preserve what mattered. The employees. The store. The family name. My grandfather's legacy. And even my brother. Not because they owed me anything. Because I no longer wanted our family to keep repeating the same cycle. Rejection. Secrecy. Pride. Resentment. Someone had to stop it. I decided it would be me. Today, that spirit level is still on my desk. I see it when I start work. Sometimes I pick it up and remember my grandfather's old lesson. Everything has to be balanced. I used to think he was talking about shelves and walls. Now I know he was talking about people too. Money can buy a business. Success can earn respect. Power can change who gets to make decisions. But none of those things can repair a family by themselves. Some things cannot be fixed with money. They require honesty. They require courage. And sometimes, they require forgiveness. I spent years trying to prove that I was worthy. In the end, I realized I had never needed permission to be. The business my father once believed was too old to save is still standing. The employees are still there. The family name is still above the door. And the old spirit level is still beside my computer. It reminds me that a legacy isn't simply what someone leaves behind. It is what we choose to repair. And sometimes, the strongest thing we can build is not a company. It is a second chance.